Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Sunday GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Keith, and today is Sunday, which means it's Hyperion Day. Technically, we're in the fall of Hyperion, which is the second book of the Hyperion series, and we're going to try to go through 10 chapters today, because 5 chapters didn't feel like quite enough for discussion, and I like intervals of 5, apparently. But if I'm being honest, we'll probably go back to 5, because 10 chapters is just way too much material to try to remember for the entirety of the week. I did listen to the first 5 chapters, that'd be 21 through 25, earlier this week, and then 26 through 30 yesterday. But unfortunately, 26 through 30 are much more fresh on my mind than 20 through 25. But we'll get around to everything eventually, as is pretty usual for the podcasts that I do. We'll talk about it later, and then 9 times out of 10, probably like 6 times out of 10 we talk about it. But all that to say, so this week, starting out in chapter 21, well, I guess we could start out, I don't know. Braun and Martin Silenus have arrived at the City of the Dead Poets. Silenus has decided to stay, explore the city in order to find some supplies, but really he is just hoping to write the rest of his poems. And Braun, Lamia, has decided that she's going to go on to the keep in order to get supplies that she can bring back to the rest of the pilgrims. We actually don't get much from Severin. Actually, I don't think there was a single chapter with Severin in these 10 chapters, which was super surprising, because we haven't heard much from him for a while. He apparently has been asleep. I don't know. Time in this novel is one of the main things that gets messed with. And like there's even the book is starting, like the narrative is starting to be twisted by time. And like we're starting to get alternative viewpoints and perspectives of the same story, in multiple different ways, which I find to be super interesting. But regardless, the chapter, I want to say chapter 21, we get a resolution, or at least a little bit of a resolution when it comes to Silenus and Lamia. So Silenus, having decided to stay in the City of Poets, is writing his poem and just kind of like absent-mindedly doing so. He's kind of like letting his muse, if you will, take him. And his muse is the Shrike. Funny phrasing, actually, Keith. So as he's writing, he's just kind of like absorbing things and remembering the way that the world was prior to the Shrike appearing on Hyperion, prior to, I guess, Silenus's interactions with the Shrike. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the Shrike appears, which we're finally getting regular occurrences of the Shrike, which makes me pretty happy, because I think the Shrike is one of the coolest parts of this book. Because it's just like so, like just almost completely impossible to understand, just because it doesn't really make sense. But I think that's kind of like the point of the Shrike in a way, is that he's not supposed to make sense. So, the Shrike appears, and Silenus is freaking out and is like, no, go away, I need to finish this poem. And he realizes that he apparently wrote "It is time" on his poem, which is funny because time is such a big theme. And the reason I'm mentioning so much of this is because there's this plot that goes from the first book into this one where they mention multiple times that Silenus is the one who's like dictating reality for the Shrike in some capacity. Like he is almost the one who is like the keeper of the Shrike, which is an interesting concept for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there's like some explanation to this as like, you know, Silenus is the last guy from original Earth who's still alive because you'd have to be like 700 years old. So he's the last one. So he has like special powers over the Shrike or something. I have no idea. I wouldn't be surprised if Simmons goes to like something about like, I don't know, intangible power that comes from like different planets and things like that. At this point, I feel like even if he did that, it would be interesting. He's just handled everything so flawlessly that I have a really hard time critiquing anything that it is that he wants to do in this book. So that's a possibility. But regardless, he wrote down "It is time," and then he starts writing again and realizes that he wrote "It's time to go." So I think that like maybe Silenus's conflict with the Shrike and the reality around him of like him saying explicitly to Bron Lamia, like, I didn't have a plan when I came here. I was just going to come here, finish my poems, and go home. And, you know, he kind of had this like feeling that he's like immortal in some capacity. And I feel like Silenus really does represent like the more negative aspects of people who write, of authors. There is this kind of like perception as someone who writes that like some aspect of you is immortal. And immortality seems to be a pretty heavy theme in this book. So as an author myself, there's this kind of like drive that a lot of authors who I've talked to share with me, that they're part of the reason that they write is because it represents like some aspect of them existing in perpetuity. And in the same way that ultimately the Pecora are like revived constantly, as long as you like aren't faced with your immediate death, there is kind of this like odd sense of like, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for precisely? You put up this particular kind of masquerade where you feel like there are certain things that you have to do in order to achieve other things, and you kind of just like constantly put off the final, like you put off the reality of what it is that you're trying to do with your art. So like Simmons mentions explicitly that Sad King Billy, this is in the first book, Sad King Billy could tell that Silenus's work was heavily edited and that there were large swaths of it that were removed prior to publishing for the first book that he wrote, which was, I think, A New Earth or something like that. He was he was coerced via money to write like 20 other New Earth novels. But the first one is the one that like really kind of was like interesting. And also it sold like a lot of copies. In the first book, there's this mention of the Pilgrim's Progress phenomena where it's like everybody bought it, but nobody read it. And so when Silenus, produces his cantos that he puts out later, or his poems about Heaven's Gate that he kind of like developed while he was on Heaven's Gate. I don't want to say wrote because he was missing language, except for a few choice words which cannot be repeated on this podcast because it is a PG podcast. But there's just kind of this idea that he's putting things off, and then like he writes these poems that are like really truly sincere to him, and like they're so powerful that they make the woman who's the editor weep. Which it's interesting. We actually got to see the editor again, which I thought was fascinating. Simmons kind of seems to be throwing in these little cameos of individuals from the first book. Like we've also met the professor who was Rachel Weintraub's lover. Emilio is his name. We've also met him a couple of times and interacted with him a couple of times, which was interesting and kind of like fun. Simmons does a really good job of like sticking little nuggets in this book to make you like feel like, oh, I'm acknowledged. Like Simmons is acknowledging that I've read the first book, which is nice. It feels good to be affirmed by the guy whose story that you're reading and falling in love with slowly or quickly. But back to the topic at hand. And there's this general perception by authors that like, oh, I'll get to do this thing that's really true to who I am after I finish this other thing that's not, because this other thing that's not is going to open a doorway for me. And Silenus has gone through all of that and then ultimately tries to write the thing that he wanted to write, and then it flops so hard that he's then kind of forced to write more of what it is that he didn't want to write. And so then it gets put off. And it seems kind of like Silenus' death in general has been something that he's feared and has put off for the entirety of his existence in a way that's more meaningful than the other characters. Silenus' struggle is kind of like very emblematic might be a good word for it, I guess, of the Fool character when it comes to like, because the first book's based off of Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. And I don't know that there is an archetype of the Fool, but like generally when you're looking at fables and all those types of things, there usually is like a satyr or a Dionysus, the god of wine and hedonism from Greek mythology. And there's usually like a fool who kind of like serves only his own purposes and ultimately becomes the victim of his own folly. And so because Silenus has unnaturally elongated his life and has like constantly prolonged the fact that he's going to have to face death at some point, it seems oddly fitting that he suffers death at the hands of the Shrike in a very specific way. So in the first book, Cassad says that he had a vision where he saw the Shrike's tree. And the Shrike's tree is this giant tree of thorns that's like 300 meters thick at its base. So it's like 1,000 feet thick. It's a huge, huge, gigantic tree that's like tall and it looks to be made of metal. And then the branches are all like thorns. Basically, they're like metallic thorns. And Cassad says that he, in his vision, saw people who were on the pilgrimage on the tree, which I find to be interesting because part of Hyperion is the fact that it's unpredictable, but like Cassad got to experience the future of Hyperion and also the past. I don't know. Time is confusing in this novel. And he said that he wouldn't tell people who were on it. Well, Silenus is the one that he saw on it. So the people who are on this tree are still alive, but they are impaled and like stuck on the tree, basically in the similar fashion to like how Father Duray self-crucified on the Tesla coil tree. They're kind of they're having the same thing happen to them, where they're just in perpetual pain for all of eternity. And that is kind of fitting with the way in which the Shrike is portrayed, because he is called the Lord of Pain by numerous individuals, especially those within the Shrike Church. And in this capacity, I'm kind of struggling with what exactly it is that the Shrike is supposed to represent in these next few, or the chapters that I read. Because it seems in the past, the way that Simmons has used him as a symbol was kind of like this specter that was like always floating around and like doing all these weird and like things that were just like not discernible by human beings as having specific motives. And the Shrike is still kind of doing that, but it seems like the Shrike has become more of a specter of death in the last few chapters, which I'm not sure how I feel about that particular representation, because I don't know. The Shrike seems inevitable in some capacity is the best way that I would describe it. And I really appreciate that Simmons kind of handles him him. Gosh. I apologize. Handles the Shrike in a capacity where it is almost kind of like a force of nature that is the only force of nature that remains true to nature. It is not able to be mastered, is not able to, be controlled. So the way in which the Shrike is being portrayed in these last few chapters is kind of befitting of that, but in some other capacities, I'm not sure how I feel about it. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more after this quick commercial break.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
The new ways in which the Shrike is being portrayed and the things that we're learning about it as an individual entity. I've mentioned this several times before, where I've said, that's a redundant statement. I've mentioned this several times before that I think that the Shrike is kind of like a monkey's paw in some capacity, in that it gives you what it is that you're looking for, but with a terrible catch. And I think that's kind of true, but I also think that it gives you the truth of what it is that you want. And I think that the reason that I'm feeling that way about its representation is because ultimately the majority of what it is that human beings want causes pain to other things. And they do so out of ignorance and not understanding the full picture of things. And that is why, like in a lot of religions, God is viewed as existing outside of time, because in order to understand the true ramifications of all of creation, I didn't mean to rhyme there, you would have to exist out of time and be able to see the end of things as well as the beginning of things and watch them unfold accordingly. So the fact that the Shrike has access to the end of things and also the beginning of things, it implies that, it implies a godliness. And on that note, I kind of wanted to make mention of the time tombs because they are moving backwards in time, which means that at some point they were created in the future. But at what point is that future going to be actualized? Or at what point do you reach the end of the time tombs? I wouldn't be surprised if that is kind of like what this novel ends up being about, because it is titled The Fall of Hyperion, which, in doing some research, the title of Keats' poem is not Hyperion Cantos. The Hyperion Cantos were incomplete. He started writing them and couldn't complete them just because he got distracted by other things. I believe his wife Fanny passed away, or his fiancée Fanny, or whatever status of relationship they had, passed away during that time, and so he got distracted, or he fell in love with her, one of the two. The Fall of Hyperion is a poem that is finished that Keats wrote, which I have not read, though it would probably be beneficial for me to do so because of reading these books. So I will probably do that at some point in the near future, if not literally between segments today. But regardless of that, moving on from Silenus, moving on from the Shrike, there's a lot more that happened in these last 10 chapters. So at the end of chapter 20, I had mentioned that the Ousters had invaded the hegemony at places that the hegemony wasn't expecting. And what the ousters did was send their ships in on like sub-Hawking travel, which I think is basically like sub-light speed travel, because their Hawking engines are traceable by like standard sensor arrays that the Hegemony possess and that the Technocore possess. And but the ousters went sub-light speed, and apparently it took their ships like 50 years to reach the different places in the Hegemony that they are targeting, which I find to be like absolutely fascinating, because 50 years would be even prior to when the Consul was sent by Gladstone to betray both the Hegemony and the ousters. The Consul, he's an interesting character, and his purposes of his actions are interesting, because it seems like he's kind of almost not even really, wow, that's a lot of, it seems like he isn't really an active agent, simply because everything that he does is planned out for him, and his behavior is so predictable that Gladstone could send him to the ousters knowing that he would betray the Hegemony, but also knowing that he would betray the ousters as well, which I find to be very, very interesting. But Gladstone finally gets to talk about what's happening in the Hegemony, and what we find out is that all of the government members are really scared. Gee, I wonder why. The ousters have hit Hegemony space, and they are within planetfall relatively quickly. And because of this, the Hegemony needs to redirect its troops. Well, if you remember from last week, they directed all of their forces to Hyperion. So now they're kind of up a creek without a paddle. So there's this like kind of discussion, and obviously I would assume that Simmons is making some sort of commentary on government systems and what have you, and the obligation that individuals have for representing different people on planets. I'm sure that he is. I don't think that it's as important to the overall, or to other meta-narratives within the book. There's some senators who say, like, I'm going to go back to the planet that I work at. But the big thing that comes out of all of this is that Gladstone kind of figures out that the Technocore has been intentionally lying to the Hegemony about the number of things that they can predict, but also the number of things that they have predicted. So, if I had to guess, the Technocore exists in this space of constant bluffing to the Hegemony. And the reason I say that is because after all of the War Council is done, Gladstone selects just a few senators, a few individuals, to go with her to her private, like, meeting room, I guess, and discuss further with them the plan of action. And one of those individuals is the representative from the Technocore, who is a hologram. And she basically says to him that, like, we're not declaring war on just the ousters. We're if the Technocore doesn't, like, provide good reason, we're declaring war on the Technocore. Or she may have even just outright declared war on the Technocore. And the representative doesn't argue, he just leaves. And there's this implication that's made by another individual that because he leaves, the Technocore is scared. Because there is some sort of nefarious plot being enacted by them in order to acquire power or to eliminate humans or to reach the next step in their evolution. Now, we as the reader know that there is a new Earth that is indeed being made by the Technocore. But I don't believe that it is knowledge for the other members of the hegemony or the hegemonic government that is occurring. It's speculation and rumor. But Johnny has informed Braun Lamia that it is indeed happening, and that there is a division amongst the three different factions of the Technocore as to how most effectively they should be executing the construction of New Earth. Now, my guess is that there's something that the Technocore is trying to prove in their own existence that we will find out later. But I'm not totally sure exactly what's going to pan out from there. But I do find it interesting that it seems like all of these individuals who are interacting with each other in all these different capacities all seem to have their own set of plans. And it seems like the only people that have any kind of success are the ones that are just passive agents of other individuals' plans. So like the consul, for instance. A lot of success, hasn't died in the book yet, but also doesn't seem to have his own machinations. His own machinations are part of the predictions of his behavior of other individuals and other things. The same thing kind of goes for Braun Lamia. Now, that situation is going to change, and don't worry, I will be getting to that. And what happens to her is very important. But she also has experienced a lot of success and not a lot of tragedy on the pilgrimage compared to other individuals who we've seen experience tragedy so far. And then, of course, Jonathan Severin, who kind of exists in this in-between world in the same way that the consul does, this in-between world of like being part of the Technocorps, but being like Gladstone's confidant and advisor in some capacities because he is the reincarnated, reconstituted John Keats persona. So he has kind of like his toes in both sides of the water. But he is not at this meeting, which is surprising because Gladstone has wanted him at every meeting, and she's explicitly said so. So I find that to be, of course, very interesting. But she does fetch him towards the end of these chapters 21 through 30. She does send for him in order to have him come, talk with her about what's going on. What we find out is that the officer who spoke out against the plan to send all of the ships to Hyperion he was, of course, he was punished by the system because the other generals really wanted to be able to seize control of the military in some capacity and send everything to Hyperion because they felt like that was the only way they're going to win Hyperion, and Hyperion seems super important. But it almost seems like Hyperion isn't really important at all. And people have just been tricked into thinking it's important by other individuals within power, which I wouldn't be surprised if that was ultimately what the Technocorps had done, which was to be like, oh yeah, we can predict everything except for the things that come along with Hyperion, which is everything. Because chaos theory? ? I'm having a hard time pinning down an exact philosophy that Simmons is kind of trying to portray or advocate for, because there is so much Nietzsche, there's a little bit of governance, so you got some Locke and some Mills in there, and there's a lot of commentary on humans and ethics, so of course you've got Kant, and then I mentioned last week this idea of Michel Foucault. Actually, I mentioned him last week in Wednesday's podcast when we talked about the movie that I watched. But I think that I've mentioned him in regards to Hyperion as well. I'm sure that he will come up if he hasn't already. But it seems to me like there is this kind of interesting link between the expansion of scientific knowledge and the understanding of the universe and the understanding of what God could look like that Simmons is trying to get at through the way that he's writing this novel, which I really enjoy. But to me, what it seems like is that for the Technocorps to say, we can't predict things because Hyperion represents an unpredictable variable. Hyperion is intrinsically involved with everything because it is a part of everything. And I think that part of what Simmons is trying to portray in the way that humans have interacted with the universe in Hyperion, in the way that individuals interact with each other, is that everything touches everything else in some capacity. And now, I know what you're going to say, that's a self-fulfilling analysis. But I think that he's doing it in a way that's more intentional than other authors might do. Because I think he's trying to make a commentary on the fact that is what authors do. When someone is writing a book, there's this storytelling mechanic. I don't know exactly what I would want to call it. But it's called Chekhov's gun. where it's like something seemingly benign occurs within a certain part of the novel that is ignored by the main character or not acknowledged enough by the main character. It represents a form of foreshadowing, but in the way that it's going to come back to bite the main character in the butt. In a way that kind of like derails the story or causes them to plunge into rock bottom, hit the nadir of their hero's journey, if you will. Which, just as a quick aside, I want to mention that it doesn't really feel like there is any hero's journey in this book, and I absolutely adore that. It seemed like there were like little mini hero's journeys with all of the individual pilgrims' stories during the first novel, but during the second novel, it really doesn't feel like there's any discernible like singular narrative to be followed, and a lot of the individuals who are in this book aren't really worthy of being considered heroes in the first place. So, but that's neither here nor there. So I think that Simmons is intentionally trying to say that we attempt to categorize the world into a series of occurrences that add up to an overall situation or an overall conclusion that can ultimately be predicted. And the Technocore has sold this idea to humans because it is appealing. And that is more commentary on this idea of immortality, where if you know the end, then why would you act outside of a way in which, like, you can't act in a way that is indicative of the fact that you don't know the end. Like, the knowledge that is present in this book that kind of represents the alien thing is the unknown, but it's in a way that's more meaningful than just saying, like, oh, the alien thing is unknown. No, like, the alien thing is the act of not knowing. And so individuals who acknowledge that there is no knowing are the aliens in some capacity in this book, at least in my opinion. So we're going to talk more about that right after this next quick commercial break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Chatting. Though this is really a one-way conversation. Sometimes I wish I had a host, or a co-host, rather. I used to do a podcast with a co-host. Check out the backlog of the music and the movie podcasts. Between November and, I want to say March, I was co-hosting with another GSMC podcast host, Cynthia. She does, at least last time I checked, she did health and wellness and a couple others. So, yeah, those were very enjoyable to do. Regardless, a co-host would be someone to bounce ideas off of and have more of a discussion with. Whereas now I just feel, sometimes I feel like I'm just talking at people. But hey, if you're listening, it means you like it when I talk at you. So cool. Thank you. Regardless, I had kind of gotten to a little bit of what it was I was. Man, I am just full of badly or poorly structured sentences today, and for that I truly apologize. Back to the topic at hand. I was talking about the thing that I feel is kind of the alien in this story, and I was going over this idea of the act of not knowing being alien. And the reason that I'm saying that this is the alien thing is because the presence of knowledge seems to be incredibly abundant in this novel. Between what it is that Gladstone believes that she knows, what the Technocore believes that it knows, or at least what it tells us that or what it has been told to us that we believe it knows, what the individuals who are on the pilgrimage believe that they know, all of those things are, it's kind of like toying with, like, what is the limitation of knowledge? And the fact that this book is a science fiction book rather than just like a typical fantasy book or something like that, to me says that there is kind of just like this general acknowledgement by Simmons of the fact that knowledge is limited, and the book necessitated being set in the science fiction world of the future, because in order for him to make his point, there needed to be an abundance of knowledge juxtaposed by the inability for there to be complete knowledge. Which is part of the reason why I think that these books make such heavy commentary on religious ideas, because in religion there's this idea that there's a God that knows all things, and that there's this constant juxtaposition of like who makes God, and what happens after God is made, and the thing that what happens after God has made something, if God exists, what happens after God makes something and that thing evolves past where that God exists. So that has just been kind of like constantly present, and I would not be surprised to figure out at the end of this that like ultimately Simmons believes that there is a God or a force that exists that cannot be surpassed, because ultimately knowledge, even at its core, is lacking. And for Simmons to basically critique the entirety of the scientific method and our discourse and rhetoric as human beings would be totally par for the course for him. It seems like he's been able to, with a lot of profundity, and accuracy for that matter, get at a lot of the things that we as human beings struggle to understand or wrestle with. And so the fact that he would actively be able to critique, or not necessarily wrestle with, I apologize, I misphrased that. He gets at things that humans do that are so subtle and so kind of like assumed that it's like virtually impossible for us to deny their existence when they're put right in front of our face. But because they're so subtle and so assumed, we always kind of let them slide, I guess, for lack of another word. But that's neither here nor there. We have 10 more chapters to get through, or 5 more chapters to get through at least. So the next person who I kind of want to talk about is Braun Lamia. And then we'll probably talk about Kassad afterwards, because some important things are happening with him. And Manuela or Marietta, I can never remember her name. I don't know why. It's funny. I listen to the book and I'm like, remember her name. And then I get to the podcast and I'm like, I don't remember her name. So Braun Lamia goes to the keep, gets there, comes back to the time tombs after this long, arduous journey, and is met by the Shrike, who proceeds to not kill her, but attach some sort of cord to the back of her head that leads into the floor of the Sphinx and connects her to the datasphere. But what doesn't make any sense to me at all is, what in the world does the Shrike have to do with the datasphere? That in itself is a fascinating thought. I wouldn't be surprised if the Technocore in the future created a time-traveling robot that is like able to move backwards in time and control the flow of time, and that's the next stage of evolution. And that the Shrike is like the Technocore's next stage in evolution. That would be interesting. Not totally sure. Because, the Shrike exists in perpetuity into the future, but also in perpetuity into the past, as do the time tombs. Supposedly, they have no beginning and no end, because if they're aging backwards and we haven't hit the end yet, then there is no perceivable end, because they haven't been able to predict it. though it seems like everything they think that they can predict in this novel, they ultimately end up not being able to predict. Regardless, Bron Lamia, we think that she's dead because it sounds like the Shrike has stabbed her in the back of the skull with its razor fingers, but we find her later via DeRay, the Consul, and Weintraub. And then we get a chapter with her in the data sphere, kind of describing what's happening. She is with Johnny. Johnny is talking about his connection to the new Keats persona, Severin. And they're kind of going over the idea of like life and death and like the experience that she has of this like pure data, pure being is described very spiritually, which I find to be interesting, as I do most things in this book. We don't get a ton of information from her other than the experience that she has with Johnny, and I wouldn't necessarily mark that as being the most important part of these few chapters. And I really want to talk more about what's happening with Cassad and DeRay and Weintraub at the end of this. So I'm going to talk about the Consul next. So the Consul, upon finding Lamia, along with Weintraub, he and Weintraub find Lamia while DeRay is back in the cave with Het Mestine, who has still not woken up yet. At least at this point. Hint, hint, I suppose. They find her, and they are the ones who find that she's been attached to the floor on the bottom of the Sphinx. The Consul follows this cable because she's on the steps. The Consul follows this cable up to the Sphinx, all the way down through all these treacherous passages that are constantly changing because the time tombs are aging backwards at a rate that is undiscernible. And so he gets to the end of it, realizes that it's like, it doesn't really have an end. It just goes into the floor and he can't follow it anymore. Turns around. You think he might hear the Shrike. Not totally sure. And then comes back out. Starts having a conversation with, well, how are we going to detach her from this? Because she is alive completely except for totally brain dead. Well, I think that's because her brain has been put into the data sphere. Which is funny that it would be her brain because generally she is the one who has had the least interaction with all of the technologies of the future. Aside from maybe Weintraub or DeRay, but during her story, Simmons makes explicit mention of the fact that she doesn't have any augmentations, and the only thing that she really has is a neural shunt, and she doesn't use a lot of technology the same way that the Consul doesn't. So the Consul reveals that he has the Hawking Mat from his story in the first novel, and he and DeRay and Weintraub are discussing what should be done. Now, the Consul's weapon that he brought to fight against the Shrike was his ship. And Gladstone is having it quarantined in Keats, which is a problem because the ship has a bunch of medical systems. It's a beautiful ship. It's incredible. And it has all these futuristic technologies that would supposedly really be able to help. And so everyone has been asking the Consul to go get it or call it to him because supposedly he has a FATCOM transmitter that would allow him to bypass the anti-entropic fields and get a signal through so that the ship would come to him because it's encoded to follow him wherever he goes according to his call for it. But because it is currently quarantined, he can't do that. So he and DeRay and Weintraub have this, I guess I wouldn't call it long discussion necessarily, about whether or not, or about who should go to get the ship. The Consul proposes that they draw lots, and then Weintraub is the only other one who's with him at this time, and he looks at him and he basically says, look, we know that you're the only one who can go. Because DeRay is old and feeble and can't travel very well just because of the cruciform and the pain associated with that, though that hasn't been mentioned, so I'm curious about what's happening there. And then Weintraub refuses to leave the time tombs because his daughter is less than 2 days old. And Rachel Weintraub seems to be becoming the quasi, I guess, ipso facto center of this story at this point, because she is kind of the last determining factor of the pilgrimage that they have to fight for. Because it seems like everything else that's happening is outside of their own power, so it seems kind of, to me, as if Rachel Weintraub kind of represents the last vestiges of an ability for them to act on the world around them. And so everybody, including Braun Lamia, Father Duray, even, of course, Weintraub, and the Consul are very concerned with the fact that her life supposedly is going to come to an end in the next 2 days. And so the Consul decides that he's going to go fly the Hawking Mat back to Keats to free his ship and come back and, I guess, save the day. I don't know. But so we get this nice little, like, I guess, reverse pilgrimage where we get to watch the Consul go backwards over all of the landmarks and things that we've already seen, which I found to be a little bit, like, it was enjoyable. The Consul kind of muses about, like, the way that things happened on Maui Covenant. He falls asleep while he's flying the Hawking Mat and gets lost, which is very inconvenient, of course, but since when has anything in Simmons' novel gone according to plan, quote unquote? Though I guess if everything went according to plan, there wouldn't be much of a novel now, would there? So, Consul is flying back to Keats, falls asleep while he's flying over the Sea of Grass, and then eventually is able to, he gets lost because he falls asleep, is able to find the river, and then pretty much as soon as he finds the river, the Hawking Mat battery decides to die, and he plummets into the river below. And that is where chapter 30 ends. Now, I know, yeah, you missed a bunch of other stuff. Don't worry, there's still one more segment, guys. I'm going to talk about Cassad. I'm going to talk about what's happening with Weintraub and Duray while the Consul's gone. Don't worry about it. But what's interesting between the Consul and Braun Lamia is that Simmons writes essentially the same chapter, but from the two different viewpoints of those individuals. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of those kinds of things happening as this book continues on. I think part of what Simmons is going to try to do is play with our perception of time within the novel, because within the novel we create our own narrative of understanding. And he wants to emphasize the experiences of the characters and their inability to understand how it is that time is passing or what is going on around them. And in order for him to most effectively do that, he has to alter our perception as well so that we can further empathize. So I'm really interested to see how he's going to handle that particular storytelling mechanic. But we're going to take one more quick break here. After that, I will talk about Cassad, Duray, Weintraub have an interesting conversation as well. So stick around. We'll be right back.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Segment of the podcast. I don't know why I'm excited about that. I should be bummed. The podcast is ending. I'm so sad. Yeah, right before the break, I was just kind of talking a little bit about what's happened with Braun Lamia, the data sphere, the Consul, and the fact that he fell into a river, and a bunch of other stuff. There were 10 chapters that I listened to, so there was a lot of story to talk about, and not as much hypothetical. So next week we will probably be going back to just 5 chapters. I feel like it gives me a little bit more of an opportunity to talk about, like, what could be coming up, make some predictions, do some conjecture, you know, the fun stuff about all this. Not that this isn't fun in some capacity. But I really wanted to talk about, and at least save it for last, I suppose, what is going on with Cassad and Manuela Moretta, who's one female character whose name I can't remember, towards the end of these chapters, because I think that Kassad is going to play a pretty major role in a lot of the conflict that's coming up. And I'm not entirely sure why it is that Simmons selected him as the vessel for that particular part of the story. But I guess we will have to wait and see and find out why. So Kassad is currently time traveling? ? So the last time that we saw Kassad, he was stepping through a portal with Moretta. That's just what I'm going to call her for the rest of the podcast. And that was it. We didn't get anything else. So, of course, when we finally got to see where he was, I was super excited. So they come out of the portal. I can't remember exactly where they go. I think they go a couple different places. But Moretta reveals to Kassad that she is like the keeper of the Shrike in some capacity. Not like a babysitter necessarily or a controller of the Shrike. I think that the Shrike may have been somehow imprisoned by Martin Silenus in some capacity. I have no idea how, or if that's even realistic, or if the Shrike is even capable of something that is capable of being imprisoned. But regardless, I think that somehow Martin Silenus had some sort of control over it. But Kassad finds out that the Shrike can be controlled by whoever beats it in one-on-one combat. Or I guess hand-to-hand combat would be the better way to phrase it. So Kassad decides that he's gonna do that. He's gonna beat the Shrike in combat, which doesn't make any sense to me, because the Shrike is kind of, it's like a god. But he finds this out, and then they end up, after they visit the couple different places with the portal that Moretta, or the portals that Moretta can open, they end up back on Hyperion, and then Kassad says, I'm going to challenge the Shrike. I do challenge the Shrike to combat, and the Shrike decides to pretty much immediately respond. And by immediately respond, I mean literally shows up right behind Kassad, and Kassad reflects on the fact that he brought just a death wand to try and kill this thing at first, and realizes how woefully inadequate that would be, and proceeds to get ready to engage with the Shrike in combat, which of course, Simmons does not give us that chapter just yet. But as he goes to engage with the Shrike in combat, it multiplies into thousands and thousands and thousands of Shrikes. And I don't think that there is more than one Shrike. I just think that it can make itself appear as if it's existing simultaneously throughout all of time. It feels like the Shrike, in some capacities, is like, this is what it would be like to interact with a god. Because that's just, God, omnipresent, omnipotent, all those things. So it would mean that like God could exist in every instance, or in all instances at the same time, as a multitude of different things. So just, I don't know. It feels like part of the point of the Shrike for Simmons is to explore as many out there theological ideas as possible and put them into the embodiment of one thing, which is very similar to how a lot of Christians would view Jesus in the embodiment of all religious principles in one particular individual. So that will probably come up at some point, I am sure. That's really all we get from Kassad. Now, the really, really interesting part about these 10 chapters, in my opinion, comes from Hetmastine. Hetmastine is the Templar who went missing off of the ship in the first book, who was presumed dead because there was a bunch of blood in his room, and he was gone. So, naturally people would assume that he was dead. It's a normal thing to assume after that type of interaction. And he randomly appears at the time tombs and passes out and has not woken up since Weintraub, Father Duray, and the consul, whose name we still don't have, found him. And so he's dying for some unknown reason because a lot of his vitals check out as normal, but he's got this weird illness that's happening. And so they kind of leave him in the cave. They go check out Braun Lamia, and then they come back. The consul decides to leave on the flying hawking mat. And so after he leaves, Father DeRay and Weintraub begin to have this conversation about the recurring dream that Weintraub had that is basically just him repeating the dream that Kierkegaard had, I think. I think Kierkegaard had a nightmare, and that was what inspired the book Fear and Trembling, or the essay Fear and Trembling. I don't know exactly what it would be qualified as, but basically Fear and Trembling is an entire system of like theology and morality based off of the idea of the fact that, you know, there's no way that God could be good and ask a human being to sacrifice their only son, and it is okay that God is not good in all capacities. And that is what Kierkegaard basically says in that essay. Well, I mean, that is the super, super, super abridged version. There's much more complexity. There's a teleological suspension of morality, I think is what it's called. There's the super fancy philosophy words for it. You don't need to know them. All that to say, Weintraub has a very similar dream. There's a reason Weintraub is Jewish in this novel, and I think it is supposed to contrast the Catholic or Protestant type belief structure that Kierkegaard was approaching that scenario with. And so Weintraub has had this recurring dream that's very similar, where someone is telling him that he needs to take his one and only daughter to Hyperion and sacrifice her and be willing to let her go. And Weintraub is of the belief that they have surpassed God in enough capacities to where they no longer need to make offerings to it, and that God needs to begin to accept a different type of offering from human beings. And I think it's interesting that Weintraub and DeRay are currently in the cave because DeRay is the one who proposed that perhaps God was a being that evolved alongside its creation. And that was part of why he was not necessarily looked upon favorably by the majority of his fellows at the, I guess, church that he worked at. I don't know. He was at a university, a Christian university, Protestantism or what have you. So they have this conversation that I think is pretty interesting. And obviously I think Simmons is trying to say that, like, he's not okay with the teleological suspension of morality or of ethics or something like that, which is basically just to say that he's not okay with the idea of a God that doesn't have to be all good. Or at least Weintraub isn't okay with that, which is why the Shrike couldn't possibly be a god to him. But then he's talking to DeRay, who basically, like, died a million deaths over and over and over and over again while begging for sweet release, and then is now, after having died, is still not freaking dead. So it's interesting that Weintraub would be the one to bring this up to him as if there was something of value that could occur between the two of them, because it feels like Weintraub is saying we shouldn't have to offer our bodies to God anymore, and DeRay would say something similar, but mainly because I already tried that. So I'm not entirely sure where this dynamic is going to go, but it does get interrupted by Head Mastine waking up. And this is probably one of the more interesting aspects of the novel that I think is, like, it's of course foreshadowing. I mean, if it doesn't happen, I'd be super surprised. Het Mastine wakes up from the middle of a fevered sleep, sits up, and starts talking about how he is supposed to be the true speaker of the tree of pain. So the Shrike's tree is supposed to be, he believes himself to have been chosen to pilot it. Which to me implies that the Shrike's tree is just like the tree Yggdrasil. The one true tree, I think is what it's called, or I can't remember exactly. It's the one tree Yggdrasil. It's a seed ship. It's a very important seed ship to the Templar. It was. It got destroyed the night that Mastine went missing. And Mastine had like a telekinetic connection to that tree, so it's unsurprising that he kind of lost his mind and passed out and then ended up in the middle of the desert and hasn't woken up since. And then when he wakes up, he's saying, I'm supposed to be what I was to the Yggdrasil. I'm supposed to be that same thing to the Shrike's tree. And he starts calling the Shrike the Lord of Pain and quoting from the theology of the Shrike Church. And this definitely is I don't know if I'd say definitely is disconcerting. It's disconcerting to DeRay and Weintraub. And after saying it, Hetmestein dies, which is such a bummer because I still wanted to hear his story as to why he was on the pilgrimage. But we did kind of get like that explanation. I'm sure that maybe we'll get something from somewhere else. I'm not totally sure. But he is supposed to pilot the tree. And if the tree can fly, then that means that the Shrike isn't confined to Hyperion any longer. If it ever was even confined to Hyperion. And there's been implication that certain things are occurring before the Shrike is released. And I think Gladstone is the one who said that. Has not yet been released. And so the implication there might be that Gladstone is from the future. It might be that she believes that it can be released. It might be a number of different things. But overall, the idea that this novel series is going to take us off of Hyperion and still involve the Shrike is exciting for me because there are other characters who I'm interested in figuring out more about. And I am interested in seeing what it is that the Shrike is capable of as far as like destructive power is concerned, because we already know that it basically has control over time, which means that even something as simple as a flick of a finger or like a punch can, if it moves through time quickly enough, the amount of motion that it takes in, like with physics, it makes like that lethal. So it's interesting. Kassad experienced just a fraction of that power when he was having his vision, when he was telling his story. So that pretty much covers it for the 10 chapters. Like I said, there's a lot there, and I really don't think that I was able to cover it all. I wanted to mention that the ousters are invading all of the planets that it was Gladstone visited. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was if the Technocore was two-timing the hegemony and giving the ousters information about the whereabouts of the CEO because they believe that the CEO might be able to have some sort of influence on the overall outcome of everything in the end. But I just wanted to mention that as more reason for us to be suspicious of the Technocore. There's a lot of things coming to a head. This book is, I think, barely even halfway done. So we will definitely be talking about it for at least the next couple, if not the next few weeks, depending on how long each chapter is. So come back next week for chapters 31 through 35. If you like the podcast, like and subscribe. You definitely won't miss any episodes. We're going to be talking about Hyperion every Sunday for sure. Maybe Wednesdays, just depends. But definitely be checking back regularly. And like I said, if you follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, give us a good review, all those things, then you'll probably be getting updates as to when the podcast episodes come out. So thank you for joining me this week, everybody. Happy 4th of July, I suppose, since that's coming up. Be safe out there. Make sure you support your local fireworks stands and then be responsible with the fireworks. You know, all that good stuff. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good day. Or night. Or whenever you're listening to this.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.